It was just another chilly morning in downtown Los Angeles. The city was alive with the usual hustle and bustle, people rushing from one place to another, cars honking, the noise of the streets filling the air. Pedestrians, their faces buried in their phones or their thoughts, barely noticed one another. Everything seemed to be moving fast, but somehow, no one was really seeing anything. In the middle of the busy sidewalk, a small, scruffy boy stood, his clothes worn and tattered. His face was pale, eyes wide with a quiet desperation that mirrored the exhaustion written all over him. He barely stood out in the chaos, blending in with the city's heartbeat, but today something was about to happen. "Excuse me, ma'am, can you spare $1?" The boy's voice trembled as he looked up at Sandra Bullock, who was just stepping out of a nearby cafe. Sandra's mind was occupied, as usual. She had a busy day ahead, meetings, work, calls, the whole deal. But as she stepped outside, something about the boy's voice made her pause. She looked down at him. His eyes, wide, pleading, told a story that wasn't in his words, a story that made her stop in her tracks. For a moment, she just stared at him, trying to process the situation. She'd seen this kind of thing before, hundreds of times. People asking for money on street corners. It was part of city life, something everyone had learned to navigate around. But the look in his eyes was different. His desperation felt real, raw. Sandra's first instinct was to pull out her wallet. To just give him $1 and move on. It was simple. Easy. But for some reason, as her fingers brushed against the crumpled bills in her purse, something stopped her. This wasn't just about money. Keanu Reeves, sitting quietly at a table just outside the cafe, had been watching the entire scene unfold. He hadn't been looking for anything in particular, just enjoying his coffee, but something about the moment caught his attention. He leaned back in his chair, watching Sandra crouch down to the boy's level, her face softening as she looked into his eyes. The boy, startled by her sudden shift in attention, took a step back. He wasn't used to anyone looking at him like that, not like a person, but like someone who truly saw him. Sandra cleared her throat softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice gentle but not pitying. The boy blinked, caught off guard. He looked down at his shoes, then back up at her. "Tommy," he muttered, barely above a whisper. Tommy. The name hung in the air between them like an unspoken invitation. Sandra looked at him for a moment, as if weighing something in her mind. The usual response, the reflexive one, would be to hand him $1 and move on. But something told her that giving him $1 wasn't enough. "How long have you been on the streets, Tommy?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly in concern. He hesitated, not sure whether to answer. His lips parted, but no words came out for a moment. He shrugged, looking down again. "A couple months," he muttered, his voice cracking a little. Sandra's heart sank. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, trying to read his face, his story. She could feel her heart pounding, the weight of the moment sinking in. Keanu sat silently at his table, observing the scene. He wasn't sure why he was so drawn into this small exchange, but something about it kept him glued to his seat. He'd always been one to respect people's privacy, especially when it came to personal struggles, but there was something in the way Sandra handled the situation that intrigued him. It wasn't just about charity. It was about connecting, about offering something that went beyond money. Sandra didn't just see a homeless boy asking for $1, she saw a person. A human being who had a story. And maybe, just maybe, she could do something about it. After a long pause, Sandra took a deep breath. She stepped closer to Tommy and put a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle, assuring him that he wasn't alone. "Listen, Tommy," she said, her voice steady, "I can't give you just $1 and send you on your way. That's not going to fix anything." Tommy looked up at her, his eyes wide with confusion. No one had ever said anything like that to him before. "I want to help," Sandra continued. "Would you like to come with me? We can talk, get you something warm to eat, maybe figure out a plan." Keanu watched from his table, his eyes softening as he watched the interaction unfold. He wasn't one to show emotions easily, but the kindness Sandra was showing, a simple act of human connection, was something rare. Something that felt good to witness. Tommy's eyes shifted nervously, unsure of what to say. He had grown so accustomed to rejection, to the quick no, or the shrug of indifference, that kindness like this felt foreign. But there was something in Sandra's voice that made him think it might be different. "Really?" Tommy asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his confusion mixed with a hint of hope. Sandra smiled, nodding. "Really?" Keanu stood up, quietly walking toward them. He was used to staying out of these kinds of moments, but something about this one made him want to do more. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a few bills, and handed them to Tommy. "For whatever you need," Keanu said softly. Tommy looked at him, stunned. The boy's face lit up, his confusion giving way to something more. A sense of possibility. In the midst of the busy street, surrounded by a world that often ignored the less fortunate, three people stood in a moment of understanding. Sandra's offer to help, Keanu's silent support, and Tommy's newfound hope. It was the kind of scene that would go unnoticed by most, but not by them. And for that brief moment, everything seemed to slow down. In the world of fast-moving lives, sometimes the greatest gift is simply to stop and see another person for who they truly are. As Sandra's words hung in the air, Tommy's eyes remained locked on her. The city around them continued its hurried pace, people rushing past, oblivious to the small, life-changing moment unfolding on the sidewalk. But for Sandra and Tommy, everything else faded into the background. There was only this moment. Only him, and her, and the unspoken promise of something better. Sandra gently placed her hand on Tommy's shoulder, giving him a warm, reassuring squeeze. "Come on, let's get out of here for a bit. I know a place we can sit down, talk, maybe get you something hot to eat." Her tone was calm, genuine, no pity, just a steady kindness that Tommy hadn't seen much of lately. For a second, Tommy blinked, unsure if she was serious. "You're not just gonna give me $1, he asked, his voice full of confusion. He had seen it all, $1 here, a spare change there, but no one had ever offered him more than that. Sandra smiled softly, her eyes meeting his with empathy. "No, Tommy. I want to help in a way that actually makes a difference. $1 won't fix anything. But maybe, just maybe, a conversation and a meal might help start something new." Keanu, still sitting at his table nearby, was now watching them both more intently. He had never expected to be pulled into something like this, a simple act of kindness turning into an unexpected lifeline for someone. But there was something about the way Sandra was handling this moment, so natural, so real, that made him feel a connection to it too. He shifted in his chair, then stood up slowly, not wanting to intrude, but knowing that this situation was too important to just sit back and watch. As he approached them, Tommy's eyes widened slightly. Keanu was known, of course. But it wasn't the fact that Keanu Reeves was standing there that made Tommy freeze, it was the quiet sincerity in Keanu's demeanor. "Hey, Tommy," Keanu said softly, his voice calm, grounded. "I don't know you, but if you ever need a place to crash or just want someone to talk to, don't hesitate to reach out." He extended a hand, offering a little more than words. Tommy looked at Keanu's hand, then back at Sandra. Both of them were offering more than just help, they were offering a lifeline. This wasn't the type of help he was used to. It wasn't just charity, it was human connection. I don't know what to say," Tommy stammered, his voice shaky. "No one's ever offered anything like that before." Sandra leaned in closer, her expression warm but firm. "Well, now you know. It's never too late to start over, Tommy." Sometimes you just need someone to show you that you matter. And that's what we're doing here." Tommy swallowed hard, his eyes welling up with tears he hadn't realized were coming. It wasn't the offer of money that struck him the most, it was the fact that they were taking the time to listen. To care. For the first time in so long, he felt like he wasn't invisible. I can't believe this," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't even know where to start. My whole life's been a mess, and now I don't know." Keanu gave a small, understanding nod. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just one step at a time. We'll figure it out." Sandra smiled at Keanu's words, then looked back at Tommy. "Come on, let's grab that meal. The first step starts with something as simple as sitting down and having a conversation." Without saying much more, Sandra gently placed a hand on Tommy's arm and began guiding him toward a nearby diner. Keanu, standing behind them, couldn't help but follow. It wasn't out of obligation, no, it was more out of respect for what Sandra was doing, for the way she was transforming this moment into something real, something that could change everything. As they walked, Sandra and Tommy started talking. Tommy hesitated at first, unsure of how to even begin explaining how he ended up on the streets. But Sandra's calm demeanor and genuine interest soon made him open up. "I used to have a family," Tommy began, his voice low but steady. "But things fell apart when my mom passed away. My dad, he didn't know how to handle it. He lost his job, we lost our house, and then one day, he just left. I was only 12. Sandra listened intently, her heart aching as Tommy continued. His story wasn't unfamiliar, it was a tragic tale of loss, neglect, and the harsh reality of life on the streets. But it was also a story of survival, of resilience. And in that moment, Sandra knew that, more than anything, Tommy needed someone to believe in him. Keanu, who had fallen into step beside them, quietly added, "We all go through tough times, Tommy. It's not where you've been, but where you decide to go from here that counts." The three of them finally reached the diner, and as they entered, the warm air inside seemed to wrap around Tommy like a comforting embrace. He hesitated at the door, looking around nervously. This was a world he had long forgotten, a place where people sat down to eat, to talk, to live. Sandra guided him to a booth in the corner, and the waitress quickly came over with menus. Keanu sat beside Tommy, giving him a reassuring smile as the waitress set down a glass of water in front of him. "Let's take it slow," Sandra said, settling in across from him. "One thing at a time." Tommy looked at the menu in front of him, his fingers tracing the edges of the paper as he tried to digest what had just happened. A few hours ago, he had been begging for $1. Now, he was sitting in a diner with two of the most unexpected people in his life, both of whom had given him something far more valuable than any amount of cash. He was given a chance. A real chance. The weight of that truth settled over him, and for the first time in a long while, Tommy felt something stirring inside him, a flicker of hope. The diner was quiet now, save for the soft hum of the background music and the occasional clink of silverware. Tommy sat in the booth, nervously fiddling with the edge of his napkin, not quite sure what to make of the situation he found himself in. Just a few hours ago, he had been standing on the cold sidewalk, asking for $1, his entire world consisting of survival and rejection. Now, here he was, sitting in a cozy diner, surrounded by two of the most unlikely people he'd ever meet, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a strange sense of possibility. Sandra and Keanu exchanged a glance across the table, both of them sensing Tommy's discomfort. This wasn't just about giving him food or a place to sit for a while. This was about giving him the space to breathe, to hope, to believe that there was more to life than what he had known. "So, Tommy," Sandra began gently, breaking the silence. "Tell me, what's something you've always wanted to do? Something you've dreamed of but never had the chance to try?" Tommy's eyes widened a little at the question. He hadn't been asked something like that in forever. His dreams had always seemed out of reach, too far gone, too impossible. But now, sitting here with Sandra's warm gaze and Keanu's quiet encouragement, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. "I don't really know," Tommy mumbled, his voice unsure. "I mean, I used to want to be a mechanic. I liked working with my hands, fixing things." He hesitated, looking down at his lap. "But I didn't think I'd ever get to do that. My dad was always too busy drinking, and when I was old enough, I had to do whatever I could to survive." Sandra nodded, her eyes softening as she listened to Tommy's words. She could hear the bitterness in his voice, the resignation that had built up over years of hardship. But there was something else there too, the faintest glimmer of a dream, buried beneath the weight of his reality. Keanu, who had been quietly observing, spoke up now, his voice calm but firm. "You know, it's never too late to start over. I've seen people rebuild their lives from less. It takes time, and it takes a lot of work, but you have something real, Tommy. You have a passion. And that's where it all begins." Tommy's eyes shifted between Keanu and Sandra. It was hard for him to even comprehend the words they were saying. No one had ever spoken to him like this. People usually just told him what he could or couldn't do, or offered him empty words of sympathy. But here, in this booth, he felt like something could actually change. Sandra leaned in a little, her tone gentle but encouraging. "What if we helped you get the training you need? You've got the desire, Tommy. We can help you get the skills, the experience. There are programs, places that can help you start fresh. It's not impossible." For a moment, Tommy said nothing. He wasn't sure if he believed it, but a part of him, somewhere deep inside, wanted to. "You really think I could do that?" he asked, his voice tentative, almost fragile. Keanu smiled, his eyes kind. "I wouldn't say it if I didn't believe it. You've got more potential than you know." Sandra added, "Sometimes, all it takes is the right opportunity, and maybe the right people believing in you." Tommy's heart pounded in his chest as he took in their words. The idea of going to school, learning a trade, finding a path that was his, it was a foreign concept, but it was also incredibly appealing. For the first time, he could almost see it. A future where he didn't have to worry about where he'd sleep at night or how he'd get by. A future where he could be more than just a kid from the streets. "You don't have to decide everything right now," Sandra said, noticing the look of uncertainty on Tommy's face. "This is just a conversation, a start. But we're here to help however we can." For the first time in years, Tommy smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but it was there. The weight he had carried for so long, the burden of feeling invisible, started to lift just a little bit. Maybe, just maybe, there was more out there for him than what he had known. The waitress returned with their food, hot plates of eggs, toast, and bacon, steam rising from mugs of coffee. Tommy glanced at the plate in front of him, his stomach growling from the long hours of hunger. As he took the first bite, he realized how long it had been since he had eaten something this filling, this comforting. Keanu and Sandra chatted easily with him as they ate, the conversation light and natural. They asked about the things he enjoyed, the small things he remembered from his childhood before everything changed. They didn't treat him like a problem to be fixed or a charity case. They treated him like a person who had just lost his way but still had the potential to find it again. When the meal was finished, and the bill was paid, Tommy felt a sense of nervous excitement rising within him. He wasn't sure where this journey would take him or what tomorrow would look like, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a chance, a real chance. Sandra stood up from the booth and smiled down at him. "We'll check out some programs tomorrow. Let's start looking into your options." Keanu, already standing beside the table, nodded. "It's a long road, but you don't have to walk it alone." Tommy stood up, his legs a little shaky from the long hours on the streets, but he felt something new, something that felt like the beginning of something better. "Thanks," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You guys, you've given me something I never thought I'd have again." Sandra smiled warmly. "You don't have to thank us. You're the one who's going to do the hard work. But we'll be here to support you every step of the way." As the three of them stepped out into the bright sunlight of the afternoon, Tommy felt a weight that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying begin to lift. The world around him was still busy, still fast, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a place in it. It wasn't just about the meal, or the money, or the fleeting kindness of strangers. It was about a new beginning. And that, more than anything else, was worth holding on to. The next day was different for Tommy. He woke up in a small, modest room above a shelter, a far cry from the cold, hard streets he'd been used to. For the first time in a long while, he felt safe. He had a bed, a roof over his head, and a chance to breathe without constantly looking over his shoulder. It wasn't much, but it was something. Sandra had been true to her word. She'd helped him connect with a local organization that provided transitional housing for young people trying to get back on their feet. More importantly, they had a program that offered training for people who wanted to learn new skills, mechanics, carpentry, even culinary arts. The choices were endless, and for the first time in years, Tommy felt like he had options. Real ones. But today was the day they were going to take the first step. Today, Sandra and Keanu had promised to help him find out more about the mechanic program. They were meeting at a small shop on the edge of town, a place that had agreed to offer hands-on training. Tommy felt a knot of nervousness in his stomach. What if he wasn't good enough? What if they didn't see potential in him? But he pushed the doubts aside. He had already come this far, he wasn't going to back down now. Sandra knocked on the door of the mechanic's shop, and Tommy could feel his heart beat faster. The door creaked open, and an older man with graying hair and a thick beard greeted them with a warm smile. "Hey there, I'm Jim," the man said, extending his hand to Tommy. "You must be Tommy. Sandra's told me about you. Come on in." Tommy shook Jim's hand, a little unsure of what to say. He had never been in a real mechanic's shop before, at least, not as someone who could actually learn something. He had always been the one on the outside, watching as others worked, wishing he could be part of it. The shop was bustling with activity. The smell of oil and metal hung in the air, and Tommy couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as he looked around. It was everything he had imagined, tools everywhere, cars being lifted up on hydraulic jacks, engines being worked on. It felt like a world he was meant to be a part of. "All right," Jim said, leading them over to a workbench. "Let's start with the basics. What do you know about engines, Tommy?" Tommy hesitated, his hands fidgeting nervously. "Not much. I mean, I've watched people work on cars before. But I've never really had the chance to learn myself." Jim nodded thoughtfully. "That's fine. We'll start slow. It's all about understanding the basics first. The engine, how it works, the different parts. From there, you can build your knowledge." Sandra and Keanu stood back a little, giving Tommy space to settle in. This was his moment, his opportunity to prove to himself that he could do something more. Jim handed Tommy a wrench and pointed to a car that was half dismantled on the lift. "Let's start by removing the alternator. It's one of the first things you'll learn to do. Take your time. There's no rush." Tommy took the wrench in his hand, his fingers a little shaky. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he focused on the task ahead. He had always enjoyed working with his hands. As he started loosening the bolts on the alternator, something clicked inside him. This was where he belonged. He wasn't the fastest, and his movements weren't as fluid as Jim's, but he could feel the pieces starting to fall into place. With each turn of the wrench, he felt more confident, more capable. Keanu watched from the sidelines, his arms crossed as he leaned against a nearby workbench. There was something about seeing Tommy in this environment that struck a chord with him. The boy was learning, evolving, starting to rebuild his life, piece by piece. Sandra, too, couldn't help but smile. She knew this wasn't going to be easy, but watching Tommy get lost in the work was a sign that he was already taking the first steps. This was his turning point. He was starting to believe in himself, and that was the most important part. As the afternoon passed, Tommy worked through a few more tasks with Jim's guidance. He wasn't perfect, but he was learning. By the end of the day, he had removed the alternator and cleaned out a few parts. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Jim clapped him on the back. "Not bad for a first day, kid. You've got a good eye for this. Keep at it, and you'll be surprised how quickly you pick things up." Tommy couldn't help but smile, his pride swelling in his chest. He had done it. He had actually done it. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose again. As they left the shop, Sandra and Keanu walked beside him, each of them sensing the change in the air. There was a sense of accomplishment in Tommy now, something that had been missing before. "You did great," Sandra said, her voice warm with approval. "This is just the beginning, Tommy. You've got so much potential." Keanu, always the quiet one, added, "You're on the right path. It won't be easy, but you've already taken the hardest step." Tommy looked up at them, his eyes a little wide with disbelief. "I never thought I'd get the chance to do something like this. I mean, I never thought I'd be here, learning something I actually care about. It feels right." Sandra smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've got what it takes, Tommy. All you need now is to believe in yourself." Keanu nodded in agreement. "And we'll be here to help however we can." As they walked down the street toward the shelter, the world felt a little brighter to Tommy. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he was looking forward to it. He was on the road to something more, and with every step, he was getting closer. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, there would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and obstacles that seemed impossible to overcome. But for the first time in his life, Tommy felt ready to face them. And as he looked at Sandra and Keanu walking beside him, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. The next few weeks passed in a blur for Tommy. He spent his days learning the basics of mechanics at Jim's shop, soaking in everything he could. He was still a little unsure of himself, but every time he successfully completed a task, whether it was changing a tire or repairing a brake system, his confidence grew. Each small victory added a little more light to the darkness that had followed him for so long. But even as Tommy found his footing in this new world, the shadows of his past were never far behind. Memories of the streets, of his father's drinking, of the nights spent alone, hungry, and cold, those memories lingered, always threatening to resurface. And sometimes, they did. One evening, as Tommy sat in the shelter's common area after dinner, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. His heart sank when he read the message. "I need you to come home. You can't hide forever. I'm still your father." The message was brief, but it hit Tommy like a punch to the gut. He hadn't heard from his father in years, not since he left for good when Tommy was just a teenager. It was a part of his life he had tried desperately to forget. The man who had abandoned him, the man who had been a constant source of anger and disappointment in his life. Tommy stared at the message for a long time, his mind racing. He hadn't thought about his father in months. He had been so focused on moving forward, on creating a future for himself, that he had pushed the past out of his mind. But now, his father was pulling him back into it. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of it all. He didn't know what to do. Should he respond? Should he go back to that toxic place, to that person who had caused him so much pain? Or should he just cut ties for good and keep moving forward? As he sat there, lost in thought, Sandra walked into the room. She had become a steady presence in Tommy's life, always offering support and encouragement. When she saw his face, she immediately knew something was wrong. "Hey, what's going on?" she asked, sitting down beside him. Tommy hesitated for a moment before showing her the message. "It's from my dad," he said, his voice low. He wants me to come home." Sandra read the text and then looked at Tommy, her expression thoughtful. "Do you want to go back there?" she asked quietly. Tommy shook his head, his throat tightening. "No. I don't want to go back to that life. But I don't know. I've spent so much time trying to forget him, trying to move on, and now he's just here. I don't know how to handle it." Sandra's gaze softened, and she put a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to decide everything right now. This is a big thing. It's okay to be confused. But remember this, you've worked so hard to get where you are now. You've made a life for yourself, Tommy. That's not something to throw away. You've come so far." Tommy nodded, but the doubt was still there, gnawing at him. He had worked so hard to get out of the mess his father had left behind, and now that same mess was threatening to pull him back in. He didn't know if he was strong enough to face it. As the evening wore on, Keanu arrived at the shelter to check in on Tommy, as he did a few times a week. When Sandra explained what was going on, Keanu's expression was calm, but there was a quiet intensity in his eyes. "Tommy," Keanu said after a moment, "I know this isn't easy. But think about what you've been doing. Think about the person you're becoming. You're not the same person you were when you were living on the streets. You found something real here. And no matter what happens with your father, that doesn't change." Sandra added, "You've worked so hard to get where you are. You have a future now, Tommy. You've got people who care about you, who are here for you. Don't let your past define you." Tommy looked at them both, their words sinking in. They were right. He had fought so hard to get out of the past, to build something better for himself. He wasn't the scared, lost boy he had once been. He was a young man who had taken control of his own destiny. But the question still lingered, what should he do about his father? "I don't know if I can just forget him," Tommy said, his voice wavering. "He's still my father. Part of me feels like I owe him something, but I don't know what. I don't know if I can go back to all that." Keanu paused for a moment before responding, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "You don't owe anyone your peace, Tommy. Your past doesn't get to decide your future. You've already shown that you can break free. But that doesn't mean you have to forget where you came from. It just means that you don't let it hold you back anymore." Sandra nodded. "You've worked so hard to get here. You're not obligated to return to a place that only brings you pain. If you choose to face your past, do it on your terms, not because someone else tells you to." Tommy sat back, absorbing their words. He knew they were right. He didn't have to go back to that life. He had spent years running from it, and now he was finally in a position to control his own fate. I guess I'm just scared," Tommy admitted, his voice soft. "I'm scared of what he might want, scared of how it'll affect everything I've worked for." Sandra smiled gently. "It's okay to be scared. But you've already proven you're stronger than you think. You've got this, Tommy." Keanu added, "And no matter what you decide, you're not alone." Tommy took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision ahead of him. He wasn't sure what the right choice was, but he knew he had to trust himself. For the first time in years, he had the power to decide his future, and that was something he couldn't take for granted. As he looked at Sandra and Keanu, he felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. They had helped him get this far, and no matter what happened with his father, he knew he had the strength to keep moving forward. With a final glance at the message from his father, Tommy made a decision. He wasn't going back. Not yet, not ever. He was going to keep moving forward, no matter how hard it got. And he would face whatever came next with the same strength he had found in himself over the past few months. The past might always be a part of him, but it no longer had control over his future. The following days felt heavy, and Tommy struggled with the decision he had made. Despite his resolve to move forward, he couldn't shake the weight of the past, especially the text from his father. He had chosen to ignore it, but the question still lingered in the back of his mind: what if there was something unresolved? What if, in turning his back on his father, he was abandoning a piece of himself that still needed closure? But as the days passed, Tommy threw himself into his work at Jim's shop. The physical labor helped clear his mind. When he was focused on fixing a car, tightening bolts, or reassembling an engine, there was no room for doubt or worry. It was just him and the work in front of him. And for the first time in years, he realized that this was the first time he had truly felt at peace. Jim had been patient with him, teaching him every step of the way. Tommy had grown from a nervous apprentice to someone who could confidently troubleshoot problems and perform simple repairs on his own. The small victories, like fixing a stubborn engine or changing an oil filter without needing assistance, gave him the confidence to keep pushing forward. One evening, after a long day in the shop, Tommy sat with Sandra and Keanu in the shelter's common area. They were talking about the future, about what lay ahead for Tommy. He had started to dream again, something he hadn't done in a long time. He was beginning to picture a future where he wasn't just surviving, but thriving. "I was thinking," Tommy started, his voice uncertain, "maybe I could start my own shop. Like, not right now, of course, but down the line. A place where people can come, not just for repairs, but to learn. A place where kids like me could find a way out, like I did." Sandra smiled at him, her eyes lighting up. "That's a beautiful idea, Tommy. You've got the heart for it. And if you keep working at this, I know you can make it happen." Keanu gave a small nod. "It's a big dream, but it's not out of reach. You've got the skills. You've got the drive. Now all you need is the belief that you can make it happen." Tommy looked at them both, feeling a surge of hope. He had been too scared to dream before. Too scared to believe that he deserved something better. But now, with every day that passed, that fear was starting to fade. Maybe he really could create the life he had always wanted. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. "Thanks, you guys," Tommy said, his voice thick with gratitude. "It means a lot, having you here." As he sat there, his mind drifting back to the idea of starting his own shop, he realized that, for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about creating something that could give others the same chance he'd gotten. It was about making a real difference. But just as things seemed to be falling into place, life threw Tommy another curveball. One afternoon, a few weeks after that conversation, Tommy received another message. This time, it was from a familiar number. His father. "I've been thinking a lot about you, Tommy. I know I wasn't there for you when you needed me. I can't change the past. But I want to try to make things right, if you'll let me." The message hit Tommy like a ton of bricks. Part of him wanted to ignore it. He had spent so long trying to get away from that man, to escape the hurt and disappointment. But now, there was something different about the message. It wasn't just a plea for reconciliation, it was a recognition of all the damage that had been done. Tommy's father wasn't asking for forgiveness, he was asking for a chance to do better. To be better. Tommy sat down on the bench outside the shelter, the message burning in his hands. His mind raced. Was this an opportunity for healing? Could he really forgive his father, or was it just another trap? The fear of being let down again gripped his chest, but there was something else, too. Something deep down, in the pit of his stomach, telling him that maybe this was the closure he had been searching for all along. It would take time, Tommy knew that. He wasn't ready to jump into some perfect father-son reunion. But maybe it wasn't about perfection. Maybe it was just about understanding, about coming to terms with the past and accepting that people, his father, included, could change. The next day, he found himself walking back into Jim's shop, feeling like he had a decision to make. He was still unsure about what he would do next, but one thing was clear: he wasn't the same person who had wandered the streets, lost and alone. He was someone who had found strength, found a future, and, maybe, found the courage to face his past head-on. "Everything okay, Tommy?" Jim asked, glancing up from beneath the hood of a car. Tommy nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. "Yeah. I think I've got to make some decisions. About my past. About my father." Jim didn't press. He simply gave Tommy a reassuring nod. "Take your time. You're doing great here. And remember, no matter what happens, you've got a whole lot more going for you than you might realize." As the hours passed, Tommy worked mechanically. He didn't think about his father's message so much anymore. He knew that whatever he decided, he was going to face it with the same determination he'd applied to his work. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Tommy felt a sense of control. The world wasn't so intimidating anymore. He had a purpose. And no matter what happened with his father, he had already built something solid for himself. Sandra and Keanu were right. He didn't have to let his past define him. He was capable of more than he had ever imagined. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Tommy allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if his father would come back into his life or if his dream of starting a shop would come true. But he did know one thing: the road ahead wasn't nearly as frightening as it once seemed. And that, in itself, was enough. The next few weeks were filled with uncertainty, but also progress. Tommy spent his days at the shop, focusing on learning and improving, while his nights were spent reflecting on the message from his father. The decision to respond, or not, still weighed heavily on him. He wasn't sure what he hoped to achieve, but there was something inside him that told him he needed to at least give it a chance. One quiet evening, as Tommy was finishing up a particularly grueling task at Jim's shop, he found himself alone in the garage, cleaning up the tools after a long day. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a soft blue-gray light hanging in the air. For the first time in a while, he felt the kind of calm that made him think he could actually handle whatever came next. But as he walked toward the door, the phone in his pocket buzzed again. He hesitated, staring at the screen as if it were a foreign object. The message was from his father once more. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, Tommy. But I'm not asking for everything. Just a chance to talk. I'm not the man I was before. If you ever want to hear me out, I'm here." Tommy's heart thudded in his chest as he stared at the message. It felt so simple, so final, like his father was giving him the power to choose. And yet, it was anything but. For so many years, he had been waiting for a chance to confront his father, to ask him why he left, why he didn't care. But now, in the face of this message, Tommy wasn't sure if he wanted answers or if he was simply looking for closure. He sat down on the stool in the corner of the shop, his mind racing. He thought about the man his father was, the man who had broken promises and abandoned him. But he also thought about the person he had become, the strength he had found, and the life he was building. Sandra's words echoed in his mind: "You don't owe anyone your peace." That thought stayed with him, even as the old fears crept in. His father had been a source of pain in his life, a shadow that lingered even after he had walked away. But maybe it was time to let that shadow fade. Maybe it was time to move forward, not by cutting his father out, but by finding a way to bridge the gap. Tommy's phone buzzed again, breaking his reverie. This time, it was Keanu. "You okay? Let's meet up when you get a chance. You're not alone in this." Tommy stared at the message for a moment. There was no judgment, no pressure, just the quiet offer of support. He could feel Keanu's steady presence in his life, and that meant more to him than he realized. He quickly typed back a simple response, "I'll be at the shelter in 30 minutes." Later that evening, Tommy sat across from Keanu and Sandra, feeling the familiar warmth of their support as they waited for him to speak. "You've been quiet lately," Keanu said gently. "Something on your mind?" Tommy took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision that had been eating at him for weeks. "It's about my dad," he began. "I've been thinking about his messages. About whether or not I should talk to him." Sandra nodded slowly. "That's a big decision, Tommy. It's hard, especially after everything he put you through." "I don't know what I'm hoping for," Tommy continued, running a hand through his hair. "Part of me wants to tell him to stay out of my life, to just leave me alone. But there's another part of me that's wondering. What if this is my chance for closure? What if I'm never going to get the answers I need unless I give him a chance to explain himself?" Keanu leaned forward, his expression calm but filled with understanding. "It's not about the answers you get from him, Tommy. It's about what you need. If you don't talk to him, that's okay. If you do, you don't have to make it about forgiveness. You're not doing this for him, you're doing it for you." Tommy's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "But what if it doesn't go the way I want? What if it opens up old wounds?" Sandra reached across the table and placed a hand on his. "Tommy, you've already made it through so much. You've built something here, something real. This conversation with your father won't define you. If it brings you peace, that's great. If it doesn't, you can walk away, knowing you tried. Either way, you've already come so far." The weight of their words settled over Tommy like a blanket. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't about rewriting the past. This was about finding the courage to face it head-on, to move forward without the fear of being held back. "I think I'm ready," Tommy said, his voice steady. "I think I need to do this. I don't know what it's going to look like, but I can't keep carrying this around." Keanu smiled, a hint of pride in his eyes. "Whatever happens, we're here for you. And you don't have to do this alone." Sandra gave him an encouraging nod. "You're not the same person you were before, Tommy. You've got a future now. No matter what happens with your father, that future is yours to shape." Tommy smiled, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. He wasn't sure what the conversation with his father would bring, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't the same scared kid he once was. He was strong, capable, and no matter what, he had people who cared about him and supported him. And that was more than enough. The following week, Tommy found himself standing in front of the familiar, run-down building that used to be his childhood home. His heart raced in his chest as he stared at the door. He hadn't been here in years. The place had been sold when his parents split, and even though it was a small house, it had always felt like a suffocating prison. The memories of his father yelling, the way his mother would cry in silence at the kitchen table, were all wrapped up in this place. But today, he wasn't a scared little boy, hiding in corners, hoping the fighting would stop. Today, he was an adult, someone who had fought for every bit of peace in his life. And whether he was ready or not, it was time to face the one thing that had held him back for so long. Tommy took a deep breath, steadied his nerves, and rang the doorbell. It felt like an eternity before the door creaked open, and there stood his father. For a moment, neither of them spoke. His father's face was weathered with age and regret, his once strong features now softened with time. Tommy couldn't read his expression, but there was something in his father's eyes, something that spoke of years of pain and missed opportunities. "You came," his father finally said, his voice quieter than Tommy remembered. Tommy nodded, swallowing hard. "I'm here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His father stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said, his voice tinged with hesitation. Tommy hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, his heart pounding in his chest. It was so surreal, this moment that he had imagined for so long. But now that he was here, all he felt was uncertainty. The inside of the house was almost unrecognizable. The furniture was different, the walls had been repainted, and it lacked the clutter that once defined it. It was almost like his father had been trying to wipe away the past, to start fresh. They sat down on the couch, the silence between them heavy, both of them unsure how to begin. Finally, his father broke the silence, his voice cracked with emotion. "I'm sorry, Tommy. I know that doesn't make up for everything, but I've been sorry for a long time." Tommy's throat tightened. For years, he had dreamed of hearing those words, but now that they were spoken, he didn't know how to respond. It felt too late for words to heal the wounds. And yet, there was something inside him, something fragile, that wanted to listen, to understand. "You left me," Tommy finally said, his voice steady, though it shook with emotion. "You left me when I needed you the most. All those years, I didn't know why. I thought it was because I wasn't enough. But now, I'm starting to understand that it wasn't about me." His father's eyes filled with tears, and he looked away. "I wasn't a good father. I thought I was doing what was best for you, but I was wrong. I ran because I didn't know how to be the man you needed. I was lost, and I thought if I left, things would get better. But they didn't. I failed you." Tommy sat back, his mind spinning. He had so many questions, so many things he wanted to say. "Why did you abandon me? Why didn't you fight for me?" But as he sat there, looking at the man who had once been everything to him, he realized that there were no simple answers to those questions. His father's pain was just as real as his own. And in this moment, neither of them had the power to undo what had already been done. "I don't know what I expected, coming here," Tommy said quietly, his voice catching in his throat. "But I'm not the same kid I was. I've had to figure out who I am without you. I've had to grow up on my own." His father nodded, wiping a tear from his cheek. "I can't take that away, Tommy. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I'm not asking for it. But I'm here, if you ever need me. I want to make things right, if you'll let me." Tommy sat silently, the weight of the words sinking in. There was a part of him, small and quiet, that wanted to hold on to the anger, to keep his father at arm's length. But there was another part of him that was tired of carrying that pain. Tired of the fear that had followed him for so long. "I'm not sure where we go from here," Tommy said, the truth of it all finally sinking in. "But I think I need to let go of the past. I can't keep carrying it with me." His father's face softened. "I understand. And I'll be patient. I don't expect anything from you, Tommy. But I hope, someday, we can build something from this. Even if it's just one conversation at a time." Tommy looked at him, finally seeing the man before him, not the father he had wanted, but the man he was now. A man who had been broken and lost, just like Tommy had once been. The difference was, Tommy had found a way to survive. And maybe, just maybe, his father could find a way to heal. "I don't know if I'm ready for all that," Tommy said quietly, his voice full of uncertainty. "But maybe we can try. One step at a time." His father smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "That's all I can ask for." As Tommy stood up to leave, he felt the weight of the moment settle over him. There were no grand gestures, no happy reunions. But there was something deeper, a fragile understanding, a possibility for healing. It was a beginning, not a perfect one, but it was a beginning. Later that evening, Tommy returned to the shelter, feeling both lighter and heavier all at once. Sandra and Keanu were waiting for him, and when they saw the look on his face, they didn't need to ask. They could see it in his eyes. "You did it, didn't you?" Sandra said softly, her smile warm and reassuring. Tommy nodded slowly, his heart still heavy with the weight of the conversation. Yeah. I did. Keanu gave him a supportive clap on the back. It's a big step, Tommy. One step at a time, right? Tommy smiled, feeling the warmth of their support. Yeah. One step at a time. For the first time in a long time, Tommy felt like he was on solid ground. He didn't know what the future would look like, but he knew that he wasn't alone anymore. He had people who cared about him, a place to call home, and a future that was his to shape. And that was enough. The days following the conversation with his father were filled with a quiet shift within Tommy. The weight he had carried for so long, the burden of anger and unresolved questions, wasn't gone, but it had lightened. It felt as though a small, important part of his past had been put to rest, not because everything was fixed, but because he had allowed himself to move forward. And though the journey was far from over, he felt like he was stepping into something new. That Thursday, after a long day at the shop, Tommy stood outside the shelter, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was a beautiful sight, and for the first time in a long while, Tommy felt at peace with where he was in life. Keanu and Sandra had both been there for him every step of the way. They had been his unwavering support, and he had come to appreciate their friendship more than words could express. They had witnessed his growth, his vulnerability, and his determination. They knew the person he had been before, angry, unsure, and haunted by his past, and now they saw the person he was becoming, strong, hopeful, and ready to embrace the future. You've come a long way, Sandra said, approaching him from behind. She had always had a way of knowing when he was deep in thought, lost in his own reflections. Tommy turned, offering her a smile. I didn't realize how heavy that weight was until it started to lift. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. It's funny, isn't it? How much we carry around without even realizing it. But I'm proud of you, Tommy. You've faced the hard stuff, and now, you're free to move forward. Keanu joined them a moment later, giving Tommy a nod of approval. You've done the hard work. Now, the rest of the journey is yours to make. You get to decide where it goes from here. Tommy smiled, feeling a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. He looked out at the horizon, at the world before him, and for the first time, he saw possibility where once there had only been doubt. You guys were right, Tommy said quietly, turning back to them. I didn't need to forgive my father to move on. I needed to forgive myself. Sandra smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. That's exactly it. Forgiving yourself is the key to freedom. It's not about what others did or didn't do, it's about giving yourself the permission to heal. Tommy took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in years. I've spent so much time blaming myself for things I couldn't control. For things that weren't my fault. But now, I feel like I'm in charge of my own future. I can choose where I go from here. Keanu grinned. That's the spirit. You've got everything you need to succeed, Tommy. The world's out there for you to grab. Tommy's mind drifted back to the conversation with his father. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't what he had hoped for, but it had been enough. His father was still the man he was, but Tommy had learned to accept that. What mattered now was the life he was building, the family he had found in Keanu and Sandra, and the person he was becoming. I'm thinking of taking a trip, Tommy said, surprising both of them. I've been so focused on surviving for so long. I think it's time to start living. Sandra's eyes brightened. That's amazing. Where are you thinking of going? Tommy shrugged, a mischievous grin forming on his face. I don't know yet. Somewhere I've never been. Somewhere I can find some peace, maybe see the world in a different light. Keanu laughed. Sounds like a good idea. Just promise me you won't forget to send postcards. I want to hear all about it. Tommy chuckled. "I'll make sure to send one. You guys have been my anchors through all of this. I'll never forget that." Sandra smiled warmly. "We'll always be here, Tommy. Wherever you go, whatever you do." The conversation turned to lighter topics, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Tommy felt like he could truly breathe. The future no longer seemed like an impossible mountain. It was a road waiting for him to walk down, and he was ready. As the evening wore on, Tommy stood up, feeling the need to do something. He had never been one to sit idly by when things needed doing. "I think I'm going to start working on that dream of mine," he said, his eyes bright with determination. "The one I've always had but never believed was possible." Sandra raised an eyebrow. "Which dream?" Tommy's face lit up. "The one where I open a workshop of my own. A place for people who need a second chance. A place where they can build, learn, and create." Keanu's face broke into a wide grin. "Now that sounds like the kind of dream I can get behind. You've got this, Tommy." Tommy looked at them both, a deep sense of gratitude swelling in his chest. "I couldn't have made it here without you two. I owe a lot to you both." Sandra placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done the work, Tommy. We were just here to remind you of your own strength." He smiled, his heart full. He was no longer the lost boy who had wandered the streets with nothing but his dreams. He was a man who had fought for his future, who had made the difficult choices, and who was now standing on the edge of a new beginning. Tommy walked away from the shelter that evening with a sense of purpose. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it didn't matter. For the first time in his life, he felt ready to walk it. And with the support of the people who cared about him, he knew he would never have to walk it alone.